So today, what I'm going to do, I think it's morning for many of you, it's evening for me, it's 6 p.m. in Los Angeles right now. For about 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about this process of putting together the story for your screenplay, which is, I liken it to a cosmology, because in essence, you're building a universe whenever you write, and especially when you're thinking about writing for film or for television. And at the end of it, after about 35, 40 minutes, we'll have time left for any questions. So while I'm talking, if a question comes to mind, just jot it down to yourself and I'll do my best to get to it at the end of the session. So back to this idea of cosmology. So if you think about writing a screenplay, writing a film as an act of creating a self-contained universe, even if you think this film is going to have multiple parts to it, you still have to think about each of these individual parts as their own universe. The big bang, the thing that starts this all off, of course, is your premise. And I want to talk, it seems like, well, we're here to talk about story, and Stephen's going to talk about premise now, but you can't even get to the essence of what your story is without a firm handle on what your premise is. Now, in the process of when I teach, when I write, when I've worked in motion picture development, I say to writers, I say to screenwriters, distill down to its core to 1 to 3 sentences, no longer than 1 to 3 sentences, what is the premise of the script that you are writing? Now, here's the important thing. There are 2 fundamental things that you want to have as part of your premise. Number 1, does the premise itself possess inherent conflict? And in 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about conflict a lot. Conflict is a fancy word, $1 million word for problem. Can we get even from the premise that the characters are going to be facing some fundamental problem, some dilemma, whatever word you want to use? If I tell you that I'm writing a movie about a shark munching people off a small New England island, you know by the very essence of a shark munching people, there is conflict. You don't know the story of Jaws from that premise, but you know what the premise is. Now, if I take that one step further, and let's say that I go beyond, let's say I have a couple sentences, 1 to 3 sentences, and I tell you that this shark is munching people over the July 4th holiday, that adds a further level of conflict. So the more conflict we can even infuse in the premise of what we're writing, the better. But if you start with a premise that possesses no conflict, you're doomed. So make sure that from the get-go, there's conflict. Now, I want to talk about this in relationship to character, which we're going to get to a second. When I teach kids writing as well. And, I say, can you have a whole movie, an entire film that's about someone losing their bicycle? Yes, depending on who the character is. There are 2 fabulous movies that the premise is someone losing their bicycle. There's Bicycle Thief, the great neo-realist Italian film. If you've never seen Bicycle Thieves, you're missing out on one of the great, I don't want to say joys because it's heartbreaking, but just an amazing work of cinematic genius. Bicycle Thieves. Has his bike stolen. Pee-wee's Big Adventure, another great movie about losing the bike. These work because at their core, the bicycle has great, profound importance to the main character. For Bicycle Thieves, it is the way in which they will survive in post-war Italy. To have a bike is to have a job, and to have a job is to make money, and to make money is to feed your family. For Pee-wee, we recognize that there is nothing more important in his life than his bicycle. So he will go to the ends of the earth, and in the movie, he will go to something that doesn't even exist, the basement in the Alamo, to get his bicycle back. Now, can you write a film that Stephen loses his bicycle? No, because I have a car too, and I don't ride my bike very much. So I would be bummed if my bike gets stolen, but it's not the end of the world. There's just not enough conflict there to sustain 90 or 120 minutes of Stephen losing his bicycle. Who cares? The second most important thing in devising your premise in this cosmology and the birth of this universe that you're creating is, are you excited by this premise? If you're not excited, then to ask me to be excited by it, it's too much. It's too much to ask. So the reality is, not only do you have to start with a premise that possesses inherent conflict, but one that you're personally engaged by, personally excited by. The word that I love to use in terms of writing, and especially in terms of cinematic writing, is engagement. Are you engaged by this idea? Would you want to see this film? If you're working on a premise that you personally wouldn't want to see, that's not the right movie for you to be writing. You should be writing a movie that is not there, it doesn't exist yet, that you want to see. This is super important because those of you that have written a screenplay before know that you will come to a point, and usually it's the same point that your character gets to in Act 2, what I call the dark night of the soul, where you want to give up. It's just you're slugging through Act 2 of your script and it just seems impossible. The thing that is going to sustain you is a premise that you're thoroughly excited by. In fact, what I recommend to my students when they start the process of writing the first draft of their script, on an index card. Index cards are your best friend as a screenwriter, and we'll talk about this in a sec. Write on an index card 1 to 3 sentences what the premise of your screenplay is, and post that wherever you write. So when you feel lost in your script, you go back to your premise and say, oh, that's what this is about. It is the DNA. It is what everything comes from the premise in this way. But again, a premise is not a story. A premise is just an idea. And I live in Los Angeles, and everyone in this town is walking around with ideas, but not everyone is walking around with a story, and that's super important. And I could give the same premise to all of you. If Jaws didn't exist, and I gave you a shark attacking people off a small New England island, and I said, I'll see you back here in 8 weeks, 2 months, no one would write Jaws. You may have elements that are similar to Jaws, but you come up with your own story, for better or for worse. I think one of the brilliance of Jaws is it's taking a simple premise and it's finding a way to really infuse it with a greater sense of narrative than just a shark munching people. That's an idea. Now, how do we get into this essence of story? How do we go from premise to story? That is the great trek. That is the great thing that a lot of us, I worked in motion picture development for a number of years, and the failing of a lot of studio films is they had a premise that they fell in love with and they went directly to trying to make a movie. They didn't take the time to figure out what their story was. They were so excited by their idea, by their premise, that they rushed right into the development of the film. And unfortunately, I saw this time and time again. It was very frustrating in development because my note would be on the drafts of the script, you don't have a story yet. You've got, you got a kick-ass premise, you got a great idea, but there's not a story here. How do you get the story? I want you to visualize it like this. In the cosmology, the bright, hot sun that burns at the center of the universe of your story are your characters. You can't do anything if you don't have a firm handle on who your characters are. Now, this seems obvious, but a lot of times we get so excited by our idea that we rush right into writing, and we haven't taken the time to figure out who the hell our characters are. Now, a lot of times people say, well, this is going to be too much work. I don't want to spend weeks developing who my characters are. But there's some fundamental things that I think you need to know about who your character is. And let me give you a trick that I use in my classes at UCLA for writers, no matter if they're working in screenplays or teleplays, even if they're working in prose, a quicker way to get a handle on who your characters are. And what this is called is turning point backstory. All of us in our lives prior to this moment right now have turning points, things that happened that shaped us into who we are today. The death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, a new job, the loss of a job, some tragedy, some great amazing thing that happened in your life prior to this moment in time. Your characters have this as well. And so one of the exercises that I do with my students at UCLA is I have them, I have them take the life of their character and to divide it into 4 equal segments. So for example, if your character is 40 years old, you go from 1 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. That's if they're 40. I mean, just you got to do a little math and figure out, 4 equal segments of the age of your character. For each of those equal segments, and this will take you a couple of days. This is invaluable for a couple of days' work to get a sense of who your character is. Write a scene that represents a turning point from that segment of their life. So for example, a character who suffered a great loss, maybe lost a parent when they were 7, you write that scene. And maybe when they were 20 or 25, they got the job that was going to turn them who they are in the time of the story, or they started the relationship that becomes critical to the story. But you're going to end up with 4 essential turning points in the backstory of your character. It is amazing how much you can learn about anyone, not just your characters, but other human beings, by 4 essential turning points from their life. This is the backstory work that you can start with. Now, look, if you want to write detailed biographies of your character, that's great. But I know a lot of writers don't want to take the time to do that. But you should take the time to come up with 4 essential turning points from the life of the character. This gives you a basis of knowledge of who the character is. Because what you're going to see in the coming parts of the cosmology is all the decisions we make in the development of our story relate back to the fundamental makeup of who the character is. I'll say that again. Every decision you make about how your story is going to unfold, we can trace back to who your character is. Now, I understand some characters are driven by one major protagonist. Some stories are driven by multiple protagonists, if it's an ensemble. But you still need to have a handle on who these characters are. And I think you need to have a handle on who your secondary characters are as well. You know, the reality is no character in their story, or in the majority of stories, know that they're the star of the story. In fact, I like to think in Shakespeare that the guy who's holding the spear thinks he's the star of, you know, Julius Caesar. He's not, but in his world he is, because that is his world. And the genius of Shakespeare is even the what we would consider to be secondary character in Shakespearean plays have great depth to them as well, especially in the tragedies. Not just Hamlet, but the other characters in Hamlet as well. So we start with some basic knowledge of who our characters are. Maybe we even start with 4 essential turning points about who they are. But now we need to get into what they do in the time of the story. So we have this premise that possesses inherent conflict that we're excited by. We have these characters that we have some knowledge on who these characters are prior to the time in the story. But now we have to deal with our characters, who they are during the time of the story. And the next essential element of narrative, and this isn't just in screenwriting, I think this is in narrative in general, but especially in screenwriting, is what I call super want. If you've never read Stanislavski, the great Russian theater director, if you've never read his book called An Actor Prepares, get a copy of it. There's probably free copies online, but you can buy a copy too. And if you remove the word actor and you put the word writer, it's all the things that we have to do Stanislavski's talking about. Stanislavski talks about it in acting as super objective. You know, if you're playing Hamlet, what is your super objective? Well, we understand if you're playing Hamlet, your super objective is vengeance for your father's death. You discover through the ghost that your uncle killed your father. And now you seek vengeance. This is it's 5 hours of playtime to get toward that vengeance. So there's a lot of action you have to take, which we'll talk about. But you start with a strong super one. If you're Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, we understand that your super objective is Juliet. And for Juliet, it's Romeo. It's as simple as that. So in super want, which is just the same as super objective, you have to ask yourself, if you asked your character, what do they want in the time of the story more than anything else in the world, what would they tell you? Super want is conscious. I can ask Indiana Jones. I can ask Luke Skywalker. I can ask Hamlet. Hey, Indiana Jones, what do you want? I want to get the Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis do. Luke Skywalker, once Obi-Wan Kenobi comes and once this message comes out from Princess Leia, we're going to go save the princess. That's not initially his want, but that becomes his super want. And then it becomes even greater than that. So think about those of you that are currently writing a script or thinking of writing a script or in the development of a script, or if you've written a script already, you should be able to, for each of your characters, but especially for your main character, what is their super want? What is that super objective? What is it that they want more than anything else in the time of the story? That drives them. That becomes, think about your super want as your spine. It's the thing that is holding the script together. Otherwise, the script starts to feel rather episodic, and and it's not to say there aren't some films that are episodic, but the vast majority of cinematic stories are held together by some sort of super want. So you think about in your story what that is. But that's the conscious want. To understand a character, the depth of a character, is also to understand what they need and the conflict between what your character needs and what they want. Need exists below the surface. Often, a character is not in touch with what they truly need, just like in life. I can go around and ask all of you now, I won't, but I could, what do you want? And you would be able to tell me something. But you might not be able to tell me exactly what you need, or what you tell me may not be the truth. This is why people spend years in therapy or years out, studying themselves to figure out what is it that I truly need. You, as the God creator of this character, you need to understand this. What is the difference between what your character says they want and what they truly need? And how potentially does that create conflict? The example that I give, I know some of you probably are in the United States and some of you are not, but I am. And we are living through a profound narrative, not just during the pandemic, which has lots of narrative involved in it and lots of conflict, a huge amount of conflict in the United States surrounding the pandemic. But we're going through a presidential election. And what I often talk about is the difference between wanting to be the president of the United States and needing to be. No one needs to be the president of the United States. Even if they say they need to be the president, that's not true. So you have to ask yourself, the people that run for president of the United States, the people that are running now, the people that have run in the past, who we've had husband and wife run, we've had father and son run, what is the deeper need of this character that potentially is not being fulfilled? There's got to be something. I mean, there's definitely this year and in all the years past, there's some deeper need that's probably not being fulfilled that then gets replaced by this crazy want. Because the reality is, you got to ask yourself, why would anyone want to be the president of the United States? Knowing the shit you got to go through to become president, and then the shit you got to go through once you're president, it seems like no one would want that. And yet, it's still a minority. It's a small amount of United States citizens, even knowing the craziness they're going to go through, what it's going to do to themselves and their family, that's still their want. Well, I make the argument that's because there's some unfulfilled need. And they seek out this want because there's some need that's not being fulfilled. So think about this with the characters that you're developing. What's their backstory? What are those turning points? Maybe even the need of your character is tied to something in their past, some turning point that was, profound. It's something not resolved. So just to keep us on track, we've gone from premise, which possesses inherent conflict, to our characters, to their want and need. And now, so we actually have a script, so we have a story, we have to talk about action. Now, the misperception about action because of the genre action is it's blowing stuff up. That's only one small form of action. The two fundamental forms of action in cinematic writing, but I think in dramatic writing in general, if you're writing, especially for film and for television to a certain degree, and to a certain degree for theater as well, but especially in film. I mean, Hitchcock used to talk about that he wanted to turn down the sound and watch a film without the sound on and understand everything. And there are some films that you could literally turn the sound down and understand mostly what's going on. That's not every film, obviously. But it's amazing the image, the language of image in cinema. It's incredible. Two fundamental forms of action. Form number one, what I do with my body to get what I want. Because that's what action is. The vast majority of actions that your character is going to take is because they want something. Scene for scene. If a script is made up of roughly 50 scenes, and it just varies from script to script, every scene in that script, your character wants something. And often the major scenes, their want is whatever that super want is. If I'm making a movie of Hamlet, what actions am I taking towards my greater goal, which is vengeance for my father's death? If I'm not taking any action towards that, that's not my super want. I mean, that's the amazing thing in writing, which is you can trace back action to want to action. If I look at a series of actions and that's not tied to the want, then the want is wrong. If I said that Romeo wants Juliet and Romeo does nothing to get Juliet, that's not his super want. And if suddenly midway through Romeo and Juliet, Romeo says, screw it, it's too hard to win over Juliet with this, her family and everything, I'll go back to Rosalind. The thing falls apart. Play falls apart. Story falls apart. We have to believe that there is nothing of greater significance in Romeo's life than winning the love of Juliet and getting to be with her even in the face of adversity. So the first form of action is what I do with my body to get what I want. So now, obviously, in an action movie, you do a lot of things with your body to get what you want. But even a non-action movie, you know, if I reach over and I touch someone, or I kiss someone, or I put my hand on someone else's hand, that action has a lot of significance to it. And, you know, think about if you're writing a film in England in the 19th century or early 20th century, it is a profound action for a man to lay his hand on the hand of a woman that is not his wife. That has great significance to it. That singular action of taking my hand and resting it on someone else's hand. So we never want to think that action, the misconception in Hollywood is like, you know, it's, you know, blow up the White House or something. It's not that. That's just one version of it. The second super important form of action is what I'm doing now, which is dialogue. I taught a whole 10 weeks for many years at UCLA just on writing dialogue for screenwriters. And when I first proposed this class at UCLA, they thought I was crazy. They're like, how are you going to talk for 10 weeks on dialogue? I said I could talk 20 weeks on dialogue. Dialogue, I mean, as a screenwriter, I will tell you it's part of your calling card. It's part of what gets you work as a screenwriter. It's part of what gets you acknowledged as a screenwriter. But beyond that, beyond whatever it does for your career in screenwriting, it is a fundamental part of how your characters go after what they want and need in language. Now, we only have a limited amount of time today, and I don't have 10 weeks to go into all the nuances of dialogue. But what I do want to say about this is, you know, if you're taking notes now or you're typing notes, you're writing, just simply write the phrase, dialogue is action, dialogue is action, dialogue is action. That's what it is. And we understand that action is born from want and need. I take actions because I want or need something. And that's why I say the things that I say. But the interesting thing that we find with characters is each character falls on a spectrum of how well or not well they use dialogue to get what they want. So think about this. If I'm Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs, I'm like off the chart on the spectrum. Like they have to create a new spectrum for Hannibal Lecter. I can literally, you know, use my words and get someone in the next cell to kill themselves. I mean, it's huge. I can talk my way into anything. That's Lecter. I mean, he literally speaks in prose sometimes. His dialogue is so profound. But that's not every character. There are some characters that struggle with language, that are what we call low manipulators. They can't use language to get what they want. So with the characters that you're devising now, if you're working on a screenplay now, think about where are they on the spectrum? Are they high manipulators like Lecter, or are they low manipulators? They're not good at using language to get what they want. I mean, the amazing thing in scene work, in screenwriting, is putting two high manipulators in the same scene and letting them duke it out. I mean, you see this in films where you just have two amazing people who are great at language getting what they want, like just tussling with each other, and all they're doing is talking. You know, it's one thing if you put a high manipulator and a low manipulator in the same scene, that, you know, that scene's probably going to be pretty short. Or it's about the act of the high manipulator destroying the low manipulator with their language. So as I said, dialogue is action. Action is what is done to get what I want or need. So I've got, just keeping us on this like cosmology, I went from my premise to my characters wants and needs, to the actions they take because of these wants and needs. I mean, the interesting thing about need is there are some stories that the character never fully grasps what they need. And yet there are some stories that the essence of the story is about what? about a character finally realizing what it is they need in life, having an epiphany. Maybe you're writing that now. Maybe some point in Act 2 or even in Act 3 of your script, your character has this epiphany about what they truly need. When we see this in romance and romantic comedy all the time, it almost starts to become cliche, which is like you want one person, but you really need to be with someone else. And it takes you the whole film to realize you are in pursuit of the wrong person, when this other person is who you truly need in your life. So think about it in context of your own character. So we have these actions, and you should be able to take any script that you write and literally write out. I mean, it almost becomes the outline of your script. What is the series of actions that your character takes to get what they want? I mean, those of you that are in the trenches right now and writing a script, do that. Make a list to yourself tonight. It's tonight here, it's not tonight. Make a list to yourself of what are the actions your character takes to get what they want. If the list is super short, that's problematic. You know, if I'm getting back to, you know, and if you haven't read Hamlet, or you haven't read Hamlet in a long time, I know I feel like, hey, it's with the Hamlet, but there's so much to learn and steal from Hamlet that you should go and read Hamlet again. Because we understand we can make a series of actions taken by Hamlet in pursuit of this greater goal, which is vengeance for his father's death. He's got a lot of machinations, a lot of stuff he's got to do. It's not as simple. Here's why Hamlet works. Because it's not as simple as going up, and we use the shank, stabbing Claudius. There was a number of years ago, and I wish I could give credit specifically to the teacher that said this. It was in an article that talked about what is the genius of Shakespeare's characters. The genius of Shakespeare's characters are, you can't swap them. The play lives or dies by which character drives it. And the example that they gave, which I love, and these are two plays, again, if you've never seen or not read, you really should see or read. I mean, see now, when we ever get to see a play again, you know, maybe in Japan, but in the United States, I can't imagine the day we actually get to sit in a theater again. If you took Richard III, which is about what? A psychopath who will murder children and seduce widows to become what? The King of England. That's his super want. And Hamlet, which is, you know, an intellectual out of college who's now being tasked to do something that is out of his depth. If we took these two characters and swapped them, we put Richard III in Hamlet, we put Hamlet in Richard III, the plays fall apart. If I put Hamlet in Richard III, the play goes on forever, because Hamlet's not capable of doing the crazy shit that Richard is capable of. If I put Richard in Hamlet, the play is 5 minutes long. 5 minutes. Because he just goes up and he shanks Claudius, maybe shanks his mother, maybe shanks someone else, and the play's done. It's a bloodbath. Because that's who Richard is. The play hinges, I mean, it gets back to that thing about me and the bicycle, which is this only works, the very premise only works depending on who the character is. All right, so what I'm getting to here is I'm sort of coming full circle back to where we started, which is once we have an idea of what the actions are that our character takes to get what they want or need, we've got to have conflict. Otherwise, the script is 3 pages long. The reason why the movie goes on as long as it does, or the play goes on as long as it does, or the novel goes on as long as it does, is because there is conflict. The great failing of so many scripts and so many movies is not enough conflict. I'll say that again. The great failing of so many stories is simply not enough conflict. You can't write the movie about me losing my bike because it's not enough conflict. I'm bummed for a day or two, and then I get another bike, or I think, well, I'm not riding a bike right now. I mean, the funny thing in the United States now, you can't find a bike. I mean, everyone's riding bikes now. And so if I lost my bike, I would not be able to get another bike now, but it's not the end of the world. I'm barely going anywhere right now. So, you know, it doesn't matter. Conflict. There are many forms of conflict, and we don't have time to talk about every form of conflict, but we do have time to talk about the 2 essential forms of conflict, especially if you are writing for cinema, for film. Form number 1, what this was originally called for hundreds of years, we can call it whatever we want. is man versus man, person versus person, character versus character. What I like to call this is the clash of opposing wants. That's the way I like to think about it. I want something, you want the opposite, or we want the same thing and we tussle, we fight over this. We are impeding each other from getting what we want. That's what characters do. People stand in the way of Romeo for being with Juliet, and people stand in the way of Hamlet, people stand in the way of Indiana Jones, Luke Skywalker, whoever the character may be. So character versus character, it's want versus want, and they come into conflict with each other. This is obviously, I mean, again, the vast majority of films, I mean, there are probably a few films that don't have this, but I would say 99.9% of films have man versus man or character versus character, the clash of opposing wants. Again, back to this idea of making lists. If you make a list of all the actions your character takes to get what they want, make a list of all the people in the story that stand in the way of your character getting what they want. Is it just one character? Is it several characters? I mean, again, back to Shakespeare, usually there's multiple characters that impede the main character from getting what they want. So think about the story that you're telling and think about who are the characters. You know, it's verses, you know, me versus someone else. That's as simple as that. You know, who's on that list, who stands in the way. But the other essential form of conflict that I don't think gets talked about a lot in cinema, or enough, like, it doesn't get talked about enough in cinema because it gets talked about a lot in literature, is man versus himself or woman versus herself, the internal struggle. If you think the vast majority of great stories for thousands of years, going back to the Bible, through the Greeks, through Shakespeare, through the history of cinema, the majority of great characters are internally conflicted as well. They've got conflicts with other characters, man versus man, but they are internally conflicted as well. You know, if you haven't seen the original Godfather in a long time, watch it again. Because in the same way that there's a lot to steal from Hamlet, there's a lot to steal from Godfather and a lot to learn from Godfather. The genius of Godfather is what becomes at the center of it is supposedly the good son, the son that wasn't going to be part of the business, becomes worse than all of them, becomes capable of things that not even his father would do. But that's a journey. That's what we call an arc. We have to take Michael and we have to put him through a lot to make him who he becomes by the end of Godfather. But there is, you know, the brilliant midpoints, and I wish we had more time because we would get into a structure too, which I'll talk briefly in a second. You know, when we talk about midpoint in a story, we're talking about a point of no return. We're talking about this idea that whatever happens at midpoint, there's no going back to the life I lived in Act 1. And for Godfather, it is this brilliant scene in this little trattoria in the Bronx where Michael is going to kill a rival boss and a chief of police. He's going to do again something that's never been done. And in this brilliant moment, he's told how to do it. You're going to go, we've hidden a gun in the bathroom. You're going to get the gun. You're going to come out blazing. You're going to drop the gun and go out. And the brilliance of Francis Ford Coppola, the brilliance in the way in which this scene is constructed is when he comes out of the bathroom, he doesn't do what he's told. That moment shows us he's still conflicted. He's nervous in the same way that we would be nervous, in the same way that Hamlet is nervous. Michael pauses. He ultimately goes through with it. But that moment shows his humanity, shows that this is hard, that it's still some internal struggle. Once he does that, he's capable of anything as a character, which we see later on in Godfather. So I want you to think about, for the characters that you're writing now, how are they internally conflicted? How are they, you know, the interesting thing, another little exercise that we do at UCLA is what's called character profiles. We write out, basically an idea, we take a profile, make a profile of the character. And for the characters that are internally conflicted, we write 2 profiles. So if I'm writing Hamlet, I write the profile that easily or is going to go through the vengeance and the side that is struggling, because Hamlet's split in 2. So think about, for your character, is this a character that really possesses 2 profiles? You know, I like to think about, especially if you're writing a quote unquote villain or an antagonist, I'm just looking at the clock, an antagonist, the greatest antagonists are split in two. You know, it's one thing to be a psychopath and just like you're always out to, you know, you have, or sociopath, let's say, and you have no human emotion and you're capable of horrendous acts of violence and you feel nothing. But that's not the majority of bad people. The majority of bad people get up and they kiss their wife and kids and they have breakfast, they kiss their wife, and they go out and they do bad stuff. There was a great acting exercise at UCLA they used to do for a number of years, where in an improvisation, they'd say to young actors in college, you're Adolf Hitler. And you're going to improvise waking up as Adolf Hitler. And then they would tell the young actor, in the room with you is a little dog. And you can do whatever you want with the little dog. And the untrained actor typically did the same thing. Well, I'm Hitler, so I take the dog and I kick it across the room or I punch it in the face. But the actor who thinks about this says, no, no, no. Isn't it more interesting if I'm playing Hitler, I pick up the dog and I pet the dog and I show such affection to this animal, but still then I go off and order the death of 6 million people. That contradiction is fascinating. That exists in a lot of characters, and it exists in a lot of villains or antagonists or whatever it is. Because again, the majority of what we consider bad people out there, they think they're doing good. I don't think the Nazis walked around and thought they thought they were like the good guys in the war. So think about this. Think about this idea of how your character is internally conflicted, capable of great love, great positive action, and capable of not positive, negative actions as well. How they split in two. Okay, so because we're almost at the end of this trend of this cosmology, but I want to like always trace it back to how these all fit together. We started with this premise that possessed inherent conflict that we were excited by. We figured out who the characters are in that idea, maybe a little knowledge about the backstory. What were the turning points for that character? We thought about in the time of the story, what do our characters want more than anything else? That's their super want. And we thought about below the surface, what is it they truly need? We thought about the actions our characters take to get what they want. And can we make a list to ourselves of all the actions taken in our story to get what I want? And then we understood that so that the script isn't 5 pages long, we have to create conflict. We have to have things that stand in the way of our character from getting what they want, impede their progress. If you have these elements, you have the matter, the source material of story. If you got these, you're on the right track. If you don't have these, you got to figure out what these are. You know, the person that says I have a story and then they can't tell me what the super want of their character is, that's problematic. Or they got 3 actions that their character takes towards any goal, and then that's problematic. But we're not done. We're almost done in time, but we're not done in cosmology. Once we have these building blocks of storytelling, of cinematic storytelling, of just storytelling in general, but especially in terms of writing a script, we have to structure it. Now, there are a ton of courses online and a lot of books, expensive books, that are going to tell you everything about structure. And they're going to look like a toaster manual. You're going to be like, what the hell? This is like, I can't make sense of this. The majority of these books, I get sent these books, and most of them, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. The easiest way to distill down structure is this. Every story has a beginning, middle, and end. Godard, the great filmmaker, said, it's not always in that order. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. Maybe it starts at the end and goes back to the beginning. I mean, if you've never read Harold Pinter's play Betrayal, read that too. It was made into a movie. It's even better as a play. It is a seemingly simple story about an affair that's told backwards, from the end of the affair to the very first moment, that the little flirtation that starts it. But that flirtation by the end of the play is infused with great meaning because of the lives that will be destroyed by this affair. That's a structural choice. Could you tell Betrayal forward? Yeah, it wouldn't be as interesting, but you could. Structure is the hand of the creator. Structure is the hand of the creator saying, what order can I put these scenes in for optimum effect. That's structure. Now, when you're, and there's a lot of elements, and again, if we had more time, we'd talk about, what happens in Act 1 and what happens in Act 2, Act 3. The thing that I want you to remember is about the solid beginning, middle, and end. And I will say that the middle, which is Act 2, when I teach it, is 50% of the screenplay. That tells you that that's why you should be writing your script, because of whatever happens in Act 2. Act 1 is a certain level of setup. Act 3 is a certain level of payoff. But Act 2 is the heart of your story. It's why we came to see the movie. It's why you should be writing the film. Act 2. You write it for all the acts, but really especially for Act 2. But the thing that I also want you to take away in this idea of structure, beginning, middle, end, that in each of these acts, they are comprised of some building blocks. And the first major building block of any act are sequences. If I'm writing a movie about a bank robbery, I'm probably going to have a sequence, which is we're casing the bank. We're figuring out how we're going to pull off the robbery. There's a series of scenes that are our process of figuring out how we're going to do the robbery. And then there's a sequence, depending on where it is structurally, sequence where I'm robbing the bank. Maybe that's made up of more than one scene. It's the scene in the bank, it's the scene getting away, the police chasing us, getting the next car, whatever it may be. Sequence is a series of scenes tied together by some narrative points. What are we saying narratively about the sequence in casing the bank or robbing the bank, whatever, or in a romance, falling in love? There may be a series of scenes that are the falling in love sequence. Now, smaller than a sequence, of course, is a scene. And I teach scene work all the time. And the thing that I remind writers about scene work is there is this moment in time, a continuous moment in time. It may be broken up by images or by a quick flashback, but for the most part, it's a moment in time, a continuous moment in time in which characters want something and take action towards that, whatever that may be. And often in the vast majority of scenes that you write, there's going to be conflict. If you got 50 scenes in your script, the vast majority of those scenes, if you go too long without conflict, the script gets boring. I've suffered from this. I've seen movies I've written and I wanted to get up and go get popcorn or pee. Like that's a mistake. That's a failing on my part. That means I had several scenes that were void of conflict. And this movie had to be reshot or re-edited or fixed in some way in post. This was usually looking at the first assemblage of the film. Scenes. But there's something smaller than scenes. We've gone from act to sequence to scene to beat. Now this, if you've read screenplays, you've seen a little thing in parenthetical that says beat. That's a different meaning for beat. That means pause. That means I'm writing dialogue and I want to tell you that they pause before the next line and I write beat, or I write pause in parenthetical, whatever it may be. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about when I talk about beat comes from the theater. And what we learn in the theater is every scene has a series of beats, a change in action or a change in emotion. Change in action or change in emotion. So go to the scenes that you write and look at what are the beats. Or, if you play the same beat over and over in a scene, I'm angry, it's a boring scene. I'm sad, it's a boring scene. Think about how the emotion changes as the scene progresses, or how the actions change as the scene progresses. From act to sequence to scene to beats. Now the last thing, and I know, we got 5 minutes. I'm gonna say one last thing and then I'm gonna open up from questions. I apologize for not leaving more time. Just there's so much that excites me about this and I wanted to distill it down to its core. The final element in our cosmology, and for many classes that you take in screenwriting, they'll make this the first element. I make it the last, which is theme. Some screenwriting classes will go to, they'll say, what's your theme? Tell me your theme. They'll say, love conquers all. That's your theme. That's what you're writing. No. My worry if you write from theme is you'll write propaganda. A lot of Soviet era cinema was written from theme, which was capitalism bad, communism good. And cinematically, they're beautiful films, but narratively, they're horrible because they're just pounding you over the head about capitalism bad, communism good. So I don't personally write from theme. I think theme is important. I think theme organically emerges in the writing of the story. So even what you think may be the theme of your script, for someone else, it's something entirely different. And you haven't failed. I mean, there's lots of people, I'm looking a lot on the screen, a lot of faces. If I gave you a script and I said, come back, in a week and let's discuss the script. If I gave you the script for Godfather and we come back and we all have different themes. We have like 50 different themes for Godfather. Is it a failing? No, it's a success. Theme is personal. It's the deeper meaning I take away from your script, from your film. Even if there's some obvious themes, there are themes that go even deeper than that. So I like the idea, T.S. Eliot, the great poet, said what was great about poetry was sometimes the meaning that the reader gets from the poem is even more interesting than what Eliot thought when he wrote the poem. And I thought, that's awesome. Like my interpretation of The Wasteland is better than what Eliot thought. That's crazy. But that's what he's saying. It's the idea in a play, in a screenplay, is that there is some deeper meaning that I take away. But I'm only going to be able to do that based upon all the other work that you do. You can't get to theme if you don't do the other work that I was talking about today. So you got to do that. You got to do that work too. Okay. So I only got a few minutes left before they're going to kick me out. But if there's any questions, I'm going to see if I can see, or you can just, Charles, do you want to see if you see someone with their hand up? And then we got one. Wait, hold on, wait. But there, Sarah has a question.
Yeah, so now that we are experiencing more types of cinematic storytelling, how do you decide which is the best vehicle for your story? So for example, you're working on something is like, should this be a 2-hour movie? Should this be 22 episodes of TV? Should this be now like Netflix and Hulu? Should this be like a 6-part 2-hour series? Should this be anime in 30-minute chunks? Like how do you decide what vehicle it should look like when you start with like the big idea?
Sarah, it's a great question, because we live in this universe now where for writers, it's exciting that we have all these forms that we can tell stories in. Originally there was just like, it was either network episodic television or film, and that was it. We've got these other forms. I mean, I was just started watching the new season of Fargo. Well, something like that didn't exist a few years ago, or it existed in a different form. I mean, ironically, you go back to the late 50s and early 60s, there was a lot of anthology television going on, and now it's sort of coming back as well. But I think the fundamental thing you have to ask yourself is, are you telling a story that is in a self-contained universe, that when you think about the story, it has a definitive beginning, middle, and end from the get-go? Or I'm telling a story that needs to breathe. The failure of a lot, and I suffered from this when I moved to television, the failure of a lot of screenwriters who become television writers is they put everything in the pilot. And the note that I would get back from the network is, Stephen, in the best case scenario, this is going to go on for years. Stop. You're doing too much. Like, stop it. So all the pilot has to do, what's an interesting thing, Sarah, that's happening now is a lot of people are taking their scripts and they're taking act 1 of their script, and that becomes their pilot. And then they let the rest of the story breathe out. It's like they felt like they were trying to do too much in the script. And then the note they got back was, you know what, this should be a series, or at least should be a 1-season thing. So I think that's the most important thing you have to say to yourself. Does it feel like this definitively has a beginning, middle, and end from the get-go? Or no, this feels like this could go on for several seasons with these characters? I mean, that's always the thing. That's the note you're going to get from every cable streaming network executive is, can you see 5 seasons with this character? And there's some movies that lend themselves to that. There's some movies that you can't, like you would not be able to tolerate it for, like Memento is a great film. I don't know Memento as a series. I don't see that immediately, but there's other films that I could see like, oh, you could take that character as they have and jettison it off to it. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I think it's interesting because I write YA, and so watching Cassandra Clare's show, that it started off as a book and then it went to a movie and and now it's a TV show. Right. And then she has more books that attach into it, or she's pulling stuff from it. And it's kind of, everything has its own vehicle and took on its own life. So it's just very, very interesting type of storytelling where we don't have to be in like one box anymore, which is great. But the downside is like, I start on it, I'm like, okay, it's going to be this. And then I'm like, that's not working. So it's going to be that. No, and that's not working. So I keep like moving around.
Yeah, I think you're right, which is that, the benefit of being a writer now is allow the story to dictate what form it feels like it's going to end up in. You know, start to figure out those story elements that I talked about today. And then if it feels like, you know what, it's too self-contained in a 120-page script. This feels like this needs multiple scripts to tell this story. Well, then it's a television project, or it's a project over multiple films. I think we got time for one or two more questions.
We have one more question, and Mark Ward had his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned the conflict, man versus man, and man versus himself. How about man versus nature?
Yes, and Mark, what I wanted to say, and this is great, which, as I said, like there are many other forms of conflict too. The two essential ones that I think you're going to deal with as a screenwriter are man versus man and man versus themselves. Man versus nature, huge, profound. In fact, I think we're living through that in a big way in the world right now. I mean, there's a major form of conflict. Ironically, the conflict that's created by the pandemic creates, at least in the United States, man versus man and man versus themselves, and all these other conflicts grow out of this. For the Greeks, obviously, a huge conflict, which we don't deal with as much now, is man versus fate. It's a huge conflict for the Greeks. Or man versus the gods. That was a huge conflict for the Greeks. So Mark, you're right. I mean, definitely nature is, and if I'm writing Twister or I'm writing about the asteroid that's going to hit Earth, I mean, I'm definitely in conflict with nature. But I think all those stories that have man versus nature come back in some form to man versus man, and I hate saying that, person versus person, and persons versus themselves too. I mean, it sort of grows out of, to be in conflict with nature usually forces us to be in conflict with ourselves and with one another. I mean, this is definitely, those of you living in the United States feel this all the time. This is the great struggle of going through the pandemic, which is, it's created all this unnecessary conflict that, you know, is ridiculous. We should just be dealing with the fact that we have this terrible plague that has befallen us. That should be bad enough, but we're creating all this other conflict for ourselves. Charles, are we done, or we have another time?
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up because we've got
Okay.
another presenter starting at 11. So everyone, if you could unmute your mics and join me in giving a round of applause to Stephen Wolfson. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, guys.
And our next presentation will start at 11 o'clock. That will be Suzanne Kamata talking about writing about disability. So see you then.
Hi, Steve. I wanted to say hello really quick.